Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is session 2 of our lecture series on decarbonizing the economy with Dan Sullivan tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I figured I'd give you a little background on what I've been involved in. Besides, I mean, everybody knows, most people know that I'm a raving Georgist and advocate of land value tax. A lot of people don't know that I was the Allegheny County chair of the Greens in 1990, and I was an organizer of the Green Conference where the watermelon coup took place. The Greens were very decentralist. They were, one of their slogans was neither left nor right, but in front. They were very environmentalist, but in a decentralized way, and there were a lot of various approaches. They had 10 key values, and the 10 key values were formulated as questions. So the 10 key values took up an entire page of text, and any proposal had to, it was like a 10-stage filter. Any proposal had to pass muster on all 10 of the key values. And one of them was decentralism, and one of them was personal and global responsibility. And one was future focus, which is very closely tied into the environmental sustainability portion of it. But what happened in 1991 at the conference in West Virginia was that a group that called itself the Left Greens basically pushed very hard and got some rule changes that people didn't understand. And then were able to pack the Greens with socialists so that the Green Party, which was founded as a rejection of both socialism and monopoly capitalism, ended up becoming, it is now part of their masthead that they are the party of environmental socialism. So I kind of watched that take place, and I left the Greens and joined the Libertarians for a while, and I found the Libertarians had been hijacked by right-wingers, so that the Libertarians were no longer what they had been. And by the time the Libertarian Party was formed, they had already been hijacked. The last truly great libertarian that I identify with is Albert J. Nock. And he was very much an individualist, but he was also very much a critic of monopoly capitalism and of the privileges that went along with that, including unlimited property and land. So I come to this as having been deeply involved in the Greens, which were the environmental, where they were always environmentalists, even though they weren't socialistic, and been involved in the Libertarians. And so I kind of find myself trying to reconcile the two and figure out which one is most legitimate now. So anyhow, I wanted to go back to the screen sharing of climate change, and talk not so much about the arguments in favor of it, although I'll touch those, because you can't discuss it without getting into what the arguments are. But the more important thing is the underlying politics and the sociological aspects of it, and what drives both the alarmists and the deniers. So let's see if I can get this to, yeah, so the climate questions, first of all, is it getting warmer? Yes, it's been getting warmer since 1820. And it seems to be leveling off, but it's still getting warmer. So yes, it's getting warmer. Now, this has been exaggerated. There's two people primarily, Michael Mann and James Hansen, who got themselves positions at NOAA and have done things like they went back and retroactively said, oh, all the old temperature data was wrong because of this, that, and the other. And there are factors that you know, if the temperature data was if it wasn't sufficiently shaded, but everybody had their thermometers in the shade. It was always, what's the temperature in the shade? But they made the argument that they overstated the temperature in the past, so they reduced it. And they didn't look at things today, like there are stations today that that are in exceptionally hot areas, so that the stations around them all have a cooler temperature. And if that had happened in the 1930s, which was an unusually hot time, they would have thrown that data out. But because it's happening now, it's in their interest to keep that data in. So yes, it's getting warmer, but not as much, I think, as the alarmist camp would have us believe. And the denial camp has their own issues. And the next question is, how much does industrial CO2 contribute to that? And that that varies from people who say it's a trivial contribution, that other factors like water vapor and stuff are much more important. And industry produces water vapor. I mean, it produces quite a bit of water vapor, but water vapor has a cooling effect. Water vapor, well, you can tell on a sunny day, it just gets hot. And on a cloudy day, it tends to be moderate. But water vapor is the #1 factor. And particulates are a major factor. So this last century, one of the theories is that this last century has been getting warmer, partly because volcanic activity has been less than usual. And particulates basically reflect sunlight outwards, so that so the sunlight never reaches the earth in the first place. But that's the next question, is how much does CO2 contribute? And there's a wide variety of opinions on that. And then the third one are, what are the effects, both good and bad? And the deniers point to the good effects, and the alarmists point to the bad effects, and both, I think, tend to exaggerate it because it's politics, it's polarized. We're here to win. We're not here to really get to the truth in either case. So, you know, I get called a denier for, I say to people, well, if not belonging to the Apocalypse of the Month Club makes me a denier, then I guess I'm a denier. But there's just been so many alarmist predictions that have not come true, that that it gives status to the deniers. And then the final thing is, what should we do about it? And that's where both the alarmists and the deniers leave me cold. And when you get into the economic effects of the proposals, then the alarmists become the deniers, and the deniers become the alarmists. In other words, the deniers say, oh, this will have these catastrophic effects, and some of the proposals will, but some of them won't. And that's where we get into the real economics question of what is the most effective for the least amount of economic damage. So now all this gets derailed by the habits of polarization. So vilifying opponents, name calling, you know, the whole thing, the word climate denier was, you know, before anybody was a climate denier, the word denier was used in conjunction with the Holocaust. So to be a climate denier was a lot like being a Nazi. I mean, it was basically one of those name calling things that's used. And the hyperbolic rhetoric is, you know, that we're going to make it sound much worse than it needs to be. And then the univariate analysis, everything is due to CO2, everything that can be. And my favorite example is the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef started dying, and the ocean was getting warmer near the Great Barrier Reef, but not by much. And the thing is, oceans warm very slowly. So a recent heat, you know, if it gets warmer this year, the ocean temperatures will be affected by that over the next 100 years. And possibly the next 1,000 years. The oceans warm very slowly and cool very slowly. But it turned out with the Great Barrier Reef that the real cause of the coral dying was that there was a big increase in sugar plantations near the coast of Australia. And these sugar plantations were basically letting their fertilizer run off into the rivers, which the Great Barrier Reef is not far from the shore. So the rivers were killing this. Well, the people who wanted to save the Great Barrier Reef and were blaming the sugar plantations were attacked from both sides, because they were attacked by the global warming people for denying that it was global warming. And then, of course, they were attacked by the sugar plantation owners for blaming the sugar plantation owners. And it eventually turned out that they won, and the sugar plantation owners now do a better job of trapping the runoff, which incurs a cost, but it also, you know, when you trap the runoff of fertilizer, you don't have to buy more fertilizer. So it ended up not being that big an expense. And now the Great Barrier Reef is much better off than it was before. But that's an example on the denier side, or on the alarmist side. On the denier side, it's like, well, if we make energy more expensive, it will hurt the poor. Well, that depends on how you do it. And it's interesting, like Jordan Peterson, who I think is brilliant on other issues, but he's jumped into economics. I think he's outside of his expertise. And he's recently just gotten a kind of almost a knee-jerk reaction to the left, because the left is terrible in some ways, but he overextends that. And so he says, well, he's against a per capita dividend because it would just make people lazy. And he's against making energy expensive, which when you reduce the supply of energy, of fossil fuels particularly, you make them expensive. That's how that works. And there's no way around that. When there's less oil or less coal available, people who can afford to bid more are gonna get it. But when we get into the solutions, we find that one of the solutions, and it's the one of, I don't know if it's perfect, but it's the one I like the most, which is the Citizens Climate Lobby proposal, which is to put taxes on carbon emissions and then distribute the revenue from those taxes on a per capita basis. And that doesn't have to be done globally. It doesn't even have to be done nationally. It's like West Virginia could do it. And West Virginia would say, okay, we've made coal and oil, which West Virginia has oil, but they mostly have coal. We've made coal more expensive and people are getting laid off, but here's a per capita dividend to every citizen of West Virginia. And because of that, the people, if the people of West Virginia have that money anyhow, then that money allows people to make a profit in other ways. So you might not have a job in the coal mine anymore, but it's not just that you get a dividend, because your dividend would be too small to matter. But all the other West Virginians have a dividend now. And those other West Virginians need their cars fixed and their sheds repaired, and they just need things done, and you can make money doing those things. So there are ways to get around this to mitigate it, but everybody's in an all or nothing kind of mindset, and I think that interferes with getting things. And so I want to get into that all or nothing mindset for a minute. And so let me pull up this thing and share screen again. And this time I want to share the sound. And this is a video by John Cleese. He was, it's not in real good shape because he made this video a long time ago, and somebody recorded it, I think, on a VHS tape. And so it was a copy of a copy on VHS before it got to here, but it's an excellent video. It's part of a much longer video. He was, the Liberal Party and the Democratic Party in England were trying joint projects. They eventually merged, and now they call themselves the Lib Dems. But he was part of that, and they were positioning themselves as the moderates. So anyhow, this is a great description of the psychology that drives today's polarization. So I thought I would show that quickly and then get back to the standard presentation, because this impacts on why we behave the way we do.
Seriously, though, we've heard a lot about extremism recently, a nastier, harsher atmosphere everywhere, more abuse and bother boy behavior, less friendliness and tolerance and respect for opponents. All right, but what we never hear about extremism is its advantages. Well, the biggest advantage of extremism is that it makes you feel good, because it provides you with enemies. Let me explain. The great thing about having enemies is that you can pretend that all the badness in the whole world is in your enemies, and all the goodness in the whole world is in you. Attractive, isn't it? So, if you have a lot of anger and resentment in you anyway, and you therefore enjoy abusing people, then you can pretend that you're only doing it because these enemies of yours are such very bad persons. And that if it wasn't for them, you'd actually be good-natured and courteous and rational all the time. So, if you want to feel good, become an extremist. Okay, now you have a choice. If you join the hard left, they'll give you their list of authorized enemies. Almost all kinds of authority, especially the police, the city, Americans, judges, multinational corporations, public schools, furriers, newspaper owners, fox hunters, generals, class traitors, and, of course, moderates. Or, if you'd rather be an extremist on the hard right, no problem, fine, you still get a lovely list of enemies, only they're different ones. Noisy minority groups, unions, Russia, weirdos, demonstrators, welfare sponges, meddlesome clergy, peaceniks, the BBC, strikers, social workers, communists, and, of course, moderates. And upstart actors. Now, Once you're armed with one of these super lists of enemies, you can be as nasty as you like and yet feel your behaviors morally justified. So you can strut around abusing people and telling them you could eat them for breakfast and still think of yourself as a champion of the truth, a fighter for the greater good, and not the rather sad paranoid schizoid that you really are.
So, now I got to get back to the screen share. And so those are the things he's talking about, the motivation behind that polarization. And it's not new because that was 1990, but it's much worse with social media. I mean, social media has made everything worse, I think. But you see that the left particularly, it's, I call it politics by tantrum. You know, we're going to glue ourselves to priceless paintings, and which is also not new. I mean, feminists did that in 1910. But we're going to basically irritate people into submission so that they'll pay attention to us. And it's never something that nobody's paying attention to. The people who do the Greta Thunberg routine of being outraged, they're always outraged about something that everybody's heard ad nauseum. It's not like somebody's not paying attention to it. But it has that that flavor, and Mark Twain wrote about it as well. He said, this is in an essay called Cornpone Opinions, and he says, self-approval is acquired mainly from the approval of other people. The result is conformity, and this drives both the left and the right. Sometimes conformity has a sordid business interest, the bread and butter interest, but not in most cases, I think. And I will add aside here that the bread and butter interest tends to be the little rudder that drives the big ship, and I'll get into that. I think that in the majority of cases, it is unconscious and not calculated, that it is born of the human being's natural yearning to stand well with his fellows and have their inspiring approval and praise, a yearning which is commonly so strong and so insistent that it cannot be effectually resisted and must have its way. A political emergency brings out the cornpone opinion in fine force in its two chief varieties, the pocketbook variety, which has its origin in self-interest, and the bigger variety, the sentimental variety, the one which can't bear to be outside the pale, which can't bear to be in disfavor, can't endure the averted face and the cold shoulder, wants to stand well with his friends, wants to be smiled upon, wants to be welcome, wants to hear the precious words, "He's on the right track," uttered perhaps by an ass, but still an ass of high degree, an ass whose approval is golden diamonds to a smaller ass, and confers glory and honor and happiness and membership in the herd. For these gods, many a man will dump his lifelong principles into the street, and his conscience along with them. We've seen it happen in some millions of instances. Men think they think upon great political questions, and they do. But they think with their party, not independently. They read its literature, but not that of the other side. They arrive at convictions, but they are drawn from a partial view of the matter in hand, and are of no particular value. They swarm with their party. They feel with their party. They are happy in their party's approval. And where the party leads, they will follow, whether for right and honor or through blood and dirt and a mush of mutilated morals. And that, to me, that sums up what's going on with the politics of global warming, that both sides are motivated by the sense of the other side is evil, and therefore our side is good. And because our side is good, if you question us, you're evil. So if you're an alarmist, any criticism of alarmism makes you a denier. And if you are a denier, any acknowledgement of the truth that the alarmists are saying makes you an alarmist. And all the moderate, sensible proposals that could mitigate the situation are just thrown out. So the next thing that we get is this follow the science, and I want to get into the funding of the science. This is Reed Bryson. He was called the father of climatology a long time ago. Reed Bryson discovered the jet stream, and this is during World War II. Reed Bryson also dramatically increased our ability to predict hurricanes and typhoons and not tornadoes. He didn't really work on tornadoes, but our understanding of how hurricanes form came largely from Reed Bryson. And he helped win World War II in the Pacific because we knew what the weather was going to be like long before the Japanese did. So we planned our island hoppings and our invasion and stuff when the weather was going to be favorable to us. And one of the things that happened was there was, I forget who, I think it was Curtis LeMay, but our Air Force commander decided to have a bombing run on Japan, and they were going to go up high in the atmosphere because that's the way those bombers went, and then drop down for the bombing. And Reed Bryson said, you're going to run into headwinds of 168 miles an hour, which was dismissed as ridiculous. But they went up and they got headwinds of 170 miles an hour. And that's when the jet stream was discovered. And the jet stream just is the primary driver of weather. So when you listen to weather reports, it's always, this is where the jet stream is, and it's going to cause this, that, and the other. But Reed Bryson, how do you vilify Reed Bryson? Well, he said that there was going to be global cooling in the 70s. And maybe there was, because there had been global cooling from 1946 to 1972, 74, around there. It depends on where you measure, but the global cooling, the people who were talking about global cooling were talking about particulates. And we had massive particulates. The Industrial Revolution, we were putting out particulates. I'm from Pittsburgh. We were like the particulate capital of the world. And then World War II, all the bombing, including the hydrogen bombing, was producing particulates. And the nuclear testing was producing particulates. And industry had ramped up and had not cleaned up. Pittsburgh cleaned up some, but we were just putting tons of particulates into the air. And what did we do in the 70s? Globally, not globally, but in all the industrial countries, which is good enough, we did a lot of cleaning. That industry was forced to clean up its pollution of primarily particulates. And if the global cooling alarmists were right, then the only way to save us from global cooling was to get rid of the particulates. Well, we got rid of the particulates and it started getting warmer again, and it started getting warmer quickly. But if you trace the graph of how much it was getting warmer up to like 1936, and then you just extend that with a dotted line, it's pretty much where we are today. So this sudden increase in temperature, is it due to increased CO2? Or is it due to the fact that we have decreased particulates? It's a good question. Now, Reed Bryson was very moderate in this. He said, well, we should reduce our dependence on coal and oil, and I don't think he talked much about natural gas at the time, but he said we should reduce it anyhow for two reasons. One is we're not getting any more of it. You know, the coal was made 300 million years ago. There's very little coal has been made after 300 million years ago, and the same for oil. These things are, you know, theoretically renewable, but you have to have another Carboniferous era for that to happen. And the Carboniferous era was basically the temperatures were much higher, and the CO2 levels were much higher, and because of that, the growth of vegetation, particularly, was extremely, everything was jungle-like. There were temperate jungles, but everything was rapidly growing and decaying and piling up. And that's why we have coal and oil in the first place. But he basically challenged the alarmists by saying, well, we've had big increases in CO2 in the past. About 10,000 years ago, the amount of CO2 nearly doubled. This was because the ice age had ended. It was rapidly getting warmer, and it released a lot of CO2. Not as much as we have now, but twice what we had 800 years before that. And the CO2 doubled, and nothing happened. In other words, the temperatures did not go up any faster than they had been going up. In fact, they leveled off for a while and then went back up. So one of the arguments in the denier camp is that CO2 doesn't cause warming, warming causes CO2, which it obviously does. It doesn't mean that both could be true, but what is definitely true is that as it gets warmer, more CO2 is produced. And so that put him in the denier camp. And I will give you, I'll put into chat, I will give you clips on all of these things. Let me grab my page that here's the okay. Let's see if this will all, yeah. So that that gives you basically, those are the three clips. The Bryson clip is a long talk. I don't want to include it because it's primarily about the thing that we're not talking about, which is it's primarily about the environmental science, and I want to get us back to the economic science. Now, this is where I think Georgists have a lot to offer. And again, this is where the alarmists become the deniers and the deniers become the alarmists sometimes, because sometimes sometimes the people who oppose these things are correct. Regulation for health and safety has always been, you know, there's economic regulation and then there's regulation for health and safety. And Georgists have never had a problem with regulation for health and safety. Although sometimes we would say, well, if our economics were in order, people would not do these things. People would not build substandard housing if everybody could afford good housing, and things like that. But we've had regulations that just plain backfired. One of them is CAFE standards. CAFE stands for Corporate Average Fuel Efficiency. And it was one of those regulations that was worked out so that the big automotive corporations wouldn't have a problem with it. But it ended up backfiring because they said, well, you can't make trucks have the same fuel efficiency as cars, because obviously trucks have to haul heavy loads, and they have to be capable of hauling heavy loads even when they're empty, which means they need more power, and they're not going to be as fuel efficient as your little Chevy Vega, whatever. So one of the side effects is that people didn't want those little Chevy Vegas and tiny fuel efficient cars. So that was a design problem in the thing, and they just allowed trucks to have lower mileage, and so people started buying more trucks. And today we see people having trucks and SUVs who really don't need trucks or SUVs. And then there's all sorts of other problems because trucks and SUVs are more deadly when they strike a cyclist or a pedestrian. It's like, well, I have no problem with you having a truck or an SUV if you need one, but I have a problem with a government policy that has that side effect. And the other thing is that even without that, they did average miles per gallon instead of average gallons consumed per 100 miles. So if you have a car that gets 20 miles a gallon and another car that gets 50 miles to a gallon, that gives you just as good as having two cars that get 35 miles to the gallon. But if you drive 100 miles with a car that gets 50 miles to the gallon, that's 2 gallons. And if you drive 100 miles with a car that gets 20 miles to the gallon, that's 5 gallons. That's 7 gallons of gas used to go those 200 miles. But if you have a car that gets 35 miles to the gallon, you don't use 7 gallons, you use about 6 gallons. So there's ways in which even the math didn't work, but they weren't trying to do the right thing. They were trying to look good. And that's one of the problems with regulation. There are regulations that can help, and obviously the regulations for coal mining have been a godsend for the miners. The black lung deaths are way down and stuff. Those are health and safety regulations. Those are not trying to manipulate the economy with regulations. Subsidies, we've been subsidizing wind and solar, and the wind and solar people will say, well, the subsidies to fossil fuels are much bigger. Well, this fossil fuel industry is much bigger. If you look at the percentage of revenue that comes from subsidy, the subsidies for wind and solar are massively higher on amount done than the subsidies for fossil fuels. And you can say, well, that's good because wind and solar are cleaner. And there's arguments both ways on that too, because the amount of land that is taken up and the birds that are killed by the wind turbines blades and the desert effects. I mean, if you put your solar panels in a desert, anyhow, there's not that much life there, but nothing lives around the solar panels, and they have to be massive in order to generate that electricity. But the biggest problem with subsidies is that you're taxing people who aren't necessarily consuming energy, and you're subsidizing energy. And there's a there's a concept that's called Jevons paradox, Jevon. And Jevons paradox is that the more efficiently you use electricity, the more electricity you use. So, for example, the old CRT television monitors used a tremendous amount of electricity, but you always turned them off. You know, you watched your show and you turned them off when you were done because you didn't want to just have that thing running and sucking up electricity. But now we have these LED flat screen televisions, and you know, I turn mine off when I go to bed, but when I get up and walk away, I don't turn off the screens because they don't use much. And people leave their lights on because they're LED lights. So one of the problems is you're subsidizing a use of you're subsidizing the consumption of energy, and maybe your way is better, but it's not environmentally positive. It might be that the wind and solar are massively less destructive than the coal plants or whatever, or that the electric cars are less destructive. But the subsidies, you're still encouraging people to use energy by making energy cheaper. And then the guy who's not using energy is paying for that. So that is a bad policy. And as we go down, they get better. So if I'm bad mouthing, I'm not going to badmouth everything. One of the problems with subsidies is that they are decided emotionally. We have been subsidizing electric cars, and these electric cars, to fit the popular notion and make so we could all praise Elon Musk. God bless him, his electric car will go 500 miles and it weighs like almost 1,000 pounds more than a gasoline car because it has to go 500 miles. Well, instead of thinking we have to get everybody into an electric car, which we can't do, what if we just said, look, a lot of people have two cars. A lot of people have two cars because both parents work and they both have to drive because they don't live somewhere there's good bus service or whatever, or the bus service doesn't take them to where they have to work. Well, your second car can be electric and it only has to go 30 miles. I mean, if you have two people working, one of those people is not going to be working more than 30 miles away. So the idea that you could have electric cars that have a shorter distance doesn't require that massive research and development, doesn't require those 750-pound batteries that are so expensive that when an electric car gets old, it gets junked. Nobody wants to replace the battery in an old electric car. So so the subsidy thing doesn't make sense that way. And look at what, electric assist bicycles are just selling like crazy. And people bike more because if you live in a hilly area, you get your normal bicycling exercise. And when you get to a hill, you kick on the electric motor and it gets you up the hill. And the electric bicycle, if you're an old guy like me, you can still go anywhere. You can take a 10-mile trip on an electric bicycle and not overtax yourself. So electric bikes are great. And when my electric bike was working, I lost weight, I was fit, I biked everywhere. I never took my car, unless it was pouring down rain, I never took my car anywhere less than 10 miles. So there's a problem with subsidies in that they're politically oriented. The big automakers have the lobbyists. The public is captivated with the idea of an electric car. So that's where the subsidies go. The subsidies to bicycles are almost non-existent. and they're going great guns. And now they have velomobiles, which is like a tricycle with an electric assist motor and a shell, and you can be completely enclosed. And you can ride that bike in the rain. And if you're not going more than 10 miles an hour or 10 miles, those are fine. So again, the subsidies, the biggest problem with subsidies is that they're politically decided, and they're based on looking good. Just like regulation, it tends to be based on looking good. Now, cap and trade, actually, cap and trade is the worst of them all. So maybe I should have not said I'm ranking them from worst to best. Cap and trade was invented by Margaret Thatcher and adopted by Ronald Reagan. It's a right-wing notion that you can turn pollution into private property. So the way cap and trade worked, which was originally called pollution tax credits, but you traded them, is that everybody who was polluting, and this was not carbon dioxide, this was sulfur and various other pollutants, they would say, okay, we've measured how much you've been polluting all along. You have a right to continue polluting to that level. And every year we're going to shave that level down a little bit. But you are grandfathered in because you've always been polluting. So your reward for having always polluted is that you now own property in the right to pollute. Now, some new guy wants to come along and he has, your oil refinery polluted this much, like X. And this new guy wants to build an oil refinery that is far more efficient and is only going to pollute half X. Well, he can't do that unless he buys pollution tax credits from somebody else who's willing to produce less. So what happens is cap and trade actually, or pollution tax credits, actually reduced the ability to reduce pollution. In other words, it hampered us because the guy who a new refinery is going to cost a lot more because it's new. It's also going to cost a lot more because it's going to pollute less, and that involves spending extra money to make it cleaner. So he's going to spend more for all that, and you're telling him he can't do that unless he buys pollution credits from the dirty refineries and the dirty steel mills. And I mean, he doesn't have to buy his credit from a refinery, but he has to buy it from a steel mill or somebody. And then the guy who wants to make a clean steel mill, it won't be pollution free, but it'll be like maybe half as much pollution as the dirty steel mill. Well, he can't do it unless a dirty steel mill shuts down and sells him the credits. So cap and trade was a horrible idea. And yet it's the one that's being pushed because it's the one that the big business has no problem with. In fact, big business loves cap and trade. One of the things that the alarmists say to vilify the deniers is, oh, these people are funded by big oil. No, big oil loves cap and trade. And as long as cap and trade is the likely solution, big oil loves it. And there's two reasons they love it. One is from the days of John D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Trust. And the famous book about this is called The History of the Standard Oil Company by Ida Tarbell. But everything she wrote was in Henry George's newspaper, The Standard. It was in little separate articles. But Henry George did a lot of writing about and other people that worked with him did a lot of writing about Standard Oil and the trust. And the reason Standard Oil was formed, John D. Rockefeller said, oil is selling for 10%. I got into the oil business, and so many other people got into the oil business that oil costs 1/10 of what it used to cost. And my operation is not making much money because too many people are selling oil. So what do we need to do? We need to get together and freeze out enough people that there's less oil being produced. And when there's less oil being produced, we can charge a whole lot of money for our oil again, like we were in the beginning. Well, that was the era of trust. That's what brought about all the antitrust legislation, because the monopoly price, Adam Smith wrote this in Wealth of Nations. He said, in competition, everybody charges the least he can get, the least he can charge, and still come out ahead and make a profit. But in a monopoly situation, everybody charges the most he can charge, and not just depress the market entirely. And what we are doing with cap and trade is we're doing for the oil companies what they're no longer allowed to do for themselves. We restrict production and they make a fortune. So when gasoline was cheap, during the Trump era, the big oil companies, some of them were on the verge of bankruptcy. A few of them went bankrupt, not the big ones, but a few oil companies went bankrupt. A few oil companies closed down and sold to another, they were remerged. But times were tough for the oil companies when they were selling cheap gasoline. When Biden came in and he promised to, not renew leases on, he ended up letting that go anyhow, because when the war on Ukraine kicked in, the demand for energy, especially in Europe, kicked way up, and we went back to doing all the things that Biden had promised not to do. But now as the price of gas went up again, now the oil companies are making record profits. So if you understand the economics, you understand oil companies love anything that restricts the supply of oil, and their favorite is cap and trade. So anybody who says that if you oppose cap and trade, you're just pandering to the big oil companies, that person has no idea what they're talking about. The American Petroleum Institute, right on their environmental page, just endorse, if you search American Petroleum Institute cap and trade, they endorse cap and trade, and they even endorse a carbon tax. This is another thing Henry George wrote about. He said, industries like, his example was the whiskey distillers. The big whiskey distillers never mind a whiskey tax. And that's true with the, America had, our first federal tax revolt was against the whiskey tax. And the big distillers love the whiskey tax because it throws out all the small distillers. A startup company can't pay the whiskey tax. The demand for whiskey, if your supply is restricted and the whiskey's more expensive, but you're new and you have to pay the whiskey tax, or you have to generate it, and you can't sell enough whiskey because of the tax, it freezes them out. So the established people are never harmed by that. But yet a carbon tax is a good idea. And a carbon tax, depending on what we untax, can be very effective. So I like a carbon tax, and the Citizens Climate Lobby's solution is to levy a carbon tax, distribute the benefits on a per capita basis. So what that means is if you use less energy, if you use less fossil fuel energy than the average person, then you will get a payment that's bigger than what you paid in carbon tax. And that includes the hidden taxes. If you buy a steel item, a steel machine or something like that, and that it not only takes energy to run the machine, but it took energy to make the machine. And the price of that carbon tax would be in the cost of that machine. So that is included in the carbon tax, and it is included in the dividend. The people who would really get over on this are the Amish, you know, and this is one of those things where, you know, it's much better because it doesn't micromanage. The regulations and the subsidies and all that stuff try to micromanage, and in trying to micromanage, they create more trucks and fewer cars. They subsidize electric cars instead of electric bicycles. You know, they do all these things because central planners cannot micromanage at all. And a carbon tax doesn't have to micromanage. It's like, okay, it's up to you to reduce your carbon emissions. It's up to you to do that. How you do it is none of our business. And that makes carbon tax the most rational, even though it does make it harder on smaller businesses who are trying to start up. But so do other taxes that those smaller businesses already pay. So if you reduce sales taxes and increase carbon taxes, you do things like that. Sales taxes are very regressive. The citizens climate lobby thing is probably it's probably progressive. Poor people use less energy than rich people, so they would get a net benefit. And there's always that marginal cost. You know, when I'm working in my garage and I'm building shelves with wood, do I want to get out the power saw, or do I want to just cut it with a handsaw? Well, now that I'm old and my neck is stiff and I have arthritis, I'll probably use the power saw. But when I was young, I would not bother getting out the power saw unless I had a lot of cutting to do, and I would do it by hand. And the Amish do everything by hand. So it has that marginal, it just works around the edges. You know, will I turn up the heat or will I put on a sweater? Well, government can't micromanage and tell you to put on a sweater. But if the heat is more expensive and you're getting a dividend check, you can spend your dividend check on sweaters. So all those things. And in the summertime, you can go around half naked instead of turning up the air conditioning. So that's the other thing. And the one thing that they completely ignore is land value tax, which reduces energy consumption far more than anybody recognizes. You know, one of the reasons people drive so far is that the good land that's up close, that a lot of people would gladly pay more to live in the city than to live in the suburbs. But the city either has high crime or it's in a very expensive neighborhood. So the most expensive in Pittsburgh, we have a neighborhood called Shadyside, and the lots are like $200,000 per lot. And somebody said, yeah, well, Sewickley Heights, you know, which is a rich it's the richest suburb. And he said, yeah, but their lots are like $1 million a lot. And I said, yeah, but the Shadyside lot is 1/10 of an acre. And the Sewickley Heights lot is 4.6 acres. Because minimum zoning in Sewickley Heights is 4.6 acres. So a lot of them are like double lots. A lot of them are like 10, 11 acres of land. So yeah, they're $4 million for 10 or 11 acres of land in the richest place in Allegheny County. But Shadyside is $200,000 for 1/10 of an acre. So that's $2 million an acre. So that's $8 million for 8 acres or for 4 acres. So, so people would really love to live in the best parts of the city that has Shadyside has 1,600 buses a week. It just has everything you need is in walking distance. It's just a glorious place to live. There would be lots of Shadysides if we replaced other taxes with a land value tax. So we ignore land value tax. A combination of land value tax and a carbon tax would work very, very well. And a carbon tax would usually take the form of an extraction royalty and an import tariff on oil. So you import oil, you pay a royalty on that because you're going to burn it here. an extraction tax, you're going to burn it here. If you export oil, well, it's a global thing, so we want to know what the other country is doing. If you export oil to Mexico, and Mexico has a carbon tax, then we don't have to levy one. It gets complicated with international trade, but not terribly complicated. So those are the policies that I think make the most sense. Within, there's certain side effects, and so let's talk about the types of energy and how these side effects work. One of the things with coal is when you put a tax on coal, you reduce the consumption of coal, and that's good because we don't have unlimited supplies of coal. I mean, anthracite coal is already gone. Anthracite coal was the best coal. It was like really high quality coal, and it was in the eastern Pennsylvania. It was this huge seam of anthracite coal. It's gone. It's really rare to find any anthracite coal. But the problem with a tax on coal, and it's not a deal breaker, but it's a problem, is that once you close a mine, that mine decays. It's really, really dangerous to try to reopen an old mine. So you do find a seam of coal. You're going to go in there and you're going to get all the coal. Well, first you get the easy coal, then you get the more difficult coal. And when the tax on coal is high enough, you're not going to bother getting more difficult coal. So you're going to close the mine. That coal will never be mined again. So that coal is just lost to the future. I don't know if there's a way to have a tax on opening a mine or something that once you get to that marginal coal, you can still get it. I haven't worked that out. But overall, reducing the rate of consumption of coal is a good thing. If we had a property tax, now here's the other thing, land value tax should apply to the mineral value of land as well. If you do that, it accelerates the consumption of coal. Well, we don't want to accelerate the consumption of coal. The whole point is to slow the consumption of coal. So you adjust your royalties and your ad valorem tax on minerals so that the royalties are high enough that the mineral value is low, then you don't have as much of effect of making people mine their coal quickly. Because if you have $1 million worth of coal there and you're taxed on $1 million, the sooner you get rid of all that coal, the sooner your $1 million mineral value falls to zero and you're no longer paying tax on that value. So how could the coal thing work? Well, what if people just said, oh, we're not going to look for coal because if we don't know there's coal down there, then nobody's going to assess us on the property tax. Alberta, Canada has a really good system. The government owns all the mineral rights. And so if you want to, they mostly have oil and oil tar and stuff from which they can extract oil. And if you're ready to suck up the oil, then you put in a bid and you get to explore. So you explore, and the government gets a copy of your exploration, and it's sealed. It's sealed for 1 year. And during that 1 year, you can bid on the right to drill oil there. And you bid on the right to do that. And you also pay oil royalties. Canada has substantial oil royalties. So you bid on the right to do the oil, and then you have a 10-year lease on the oil. And you're expected to suck all that oil out in 10 years. Well, does that accelerate the extraction of oil? Well, it slows down the exploration. People don't go looking for oil in Alberta unless they're within 10 years of sucking it out, because they find the oil, their lease expires, now they got nothing to show for their exploration costs. So, you know, and even then, other people can bid against you, but you're bidding with the knowledge. You dug the core samples, you know if there's oil down there. Everybody else has not. And so they would be bidding blind unless they also drilled for core samples. So, so it works, you know, the charging oil royalties works decently well with oil, works well with coal, works well with natural gas. Nuclear, I don't know that, well, we don't have to tax for CO2 emissions with nuclear. It's interesting that the nuclear lobby is what started the fossil fuel, the global warming scare in the first place. All the funding, this was in Reed Bryson's video, he said all the funding, this in 1990, all the funding to study the bad effects of global warming came from the Atomic Energy Commission, which is now called the Department of Energy. But back then it was specifically the Atomic Energy Commission, and regulatory capture had taken place. Westinghouse and other big corporate manufacturers of atomic energy, of nuclear power plants, were basically in charge of they had basically controlled the Atomic Energy Commission. There was a revolving door relationship between them. And so all this bad-mouthing of fossil fuels was being financed by the nuclear companies, by Westinghouse and their friends. And then 3 Mile Island happened, which was actually a kind of a minor problem, but it captured everybody's fear. And just by perfect coincidence, the movie The China Syndrome was in production already, was about to be released when 3 Mile Island hit. And so everybody was captivated by this movie, The China Syndrome. And The China Syndrome was basically science fiction. It described something that was only true of the very first nuclear power plants. The way a nuclear power plant works, especially the modern ones, is the nuclear rods come out on their own. If the power shuts down, the nuclear rods come out, and the radiation stops. The nuclear rods are all joined together. Let me turn off screen share here. The nuclear rods are all joined together to make the heat that runs the turbines that makes the electricity. Power pushes them together. It does not pull them apart. They pull apart on their own. It's the same concept as George Westinghouse developed for the air brakes on trains, which was the old air brakes. If they failed, the train wouldn't stop. He changed it so the brakes were spring loaded to grab, and the power of the air brake was to hold the brake open. So if the brake line failed, the trains wouldn't go. Instead of having trains that wouldn't stop, you had trains that wouldn't go. Nuclear power is the same way. But anyhow, it just made everybody hysterical. And the socialist left, who's looking to badmouth things, was able to badmouth nuclear. So now we have coal is bad, oil's bad, natural gas is bad, and now people believe that nuclear is bad. And nuclear has problems, but not as big of problems as people let on. And the same thing happened to hydroelectric. The snail darter, which was, we find these tiny genetic variations, and the snail darter only existed in one stream. And it was just like all sorts of other little fish, other little darters. And it was called a snail darter. I mean, the word even sounds like an oxymoron, because a darter goes very fast, a snail goes very slowly. It was snail colored. But hydroelectric got interfered with by environmentalists who said, well, you can't dam up this river, you can't dam up that one. And in a way, there's good arguments for saying we've overdone that. And hydromechanical is, well, you know, the old mills, that's why we have the term mildew. The old mills ground flour on a wheel that was water powered, so that was hydromechanical. But the most interesting use of hydromechanical today is like Niagara Falls. If you go to Niagara Falls late at night, there's hardly any water going over Niagara Falls late at night, because there's less water even in the daytime, but they power a large area of northern New York and southern Canada from Niagara Falls. And at nighttime, when nobody's looking at the waterfall, they divert lots of water into a reservoir that they pump the water up into this giant reservoir. And then in the daytime, when the demand for energy is higher, and when you can't be tapping Niagara Falls because people want to see the waterfall, they drain the reservoir through a power plant. So that's hydromechanical to store it. It's like creating a battery, only it's water power, and then it comes down. So that's that. And then wind and solar are great when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. Unfortunately, air tends to be most turbulent in the summer when the sun is shining, and least turbulent in the winter. So you have very still, cold, wintry nights. And solar doesn't work if it's covered with snow, so you have to defrost the solar panels. And people talk about batteries and fuel cells. Fuel cells are just high-powered batteries. You know, the fuel cell weighs less than a battery for the amount of energy. And then the type of energy that everybody ignores is human energy. You know, when human beings are sitting around, I mean, if I'm sitting around because I'm tired, or because I enjoy sitting around, or because I'm on vacation and I'm sitting around in the Bahamas or something, that's great. But there's lots of people who are sitting around who have nothing to do. And when we talk about taxing energy, the fact of the matter is we tax human energy higher than anything else. The carbon tax that the conservatives are screaming about, nobody in their wildest dreams thinks that they would tax carbon as heavily as we're taxing human beings, because we have wage taxes, and you know, unemployment compensation comes out of your payroll, and some of it comes out of what your employer pays, but you don't see that, but that makes the employer less likely to hire people. All of the things that people say are bad, that, you know, taxing oil would destroy jobs. Nothing destroys jobs like taxing jobs. And we put more taxes on jobs than on anything. And you not only get taxed, not only does money come out of your paycheck, and money come out of your employer before you even see your paycheck, so that money comes out, but then when you go to spend the money, you pay sales tax. And that sales tax comes out of the purchasing power that you have as an employee. So all of these taxes are on human energy. And if we want to be very practical and very simple, we can untax human energy and put that tax on pollution. And how much of it should be on CO2, and how much of it should be on sulfur, and how much of it should be on lots of other pollutants that we used to pay a lot of attention to that are much more real than CO2. All those pollutants can be taxed, and they can be taxed to the point where there are no taxes on human beings. And there's no net loss if we untax human beings. So part of it, the Citizens Climate Lobby, we can give everybody a per capita dividend. We can do that with some of it, and we can replace other taxes with that tax too. So I think that's the end of what I have in mind. Let me see if there's, well, that doesn't matter. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan.
So yeah, let's just take questions.
All right. Marty Roland. You need to unmute Marty.
Okay, finally. Yeah, it was great class, Dan. It fits very well with what Mike had to say and what I'm going to say next week. But one of the things that I liked is that you provided, the pros and cons of both sides of the alarmists and the deniers, so that people can kind of think for themselves, which is somewhat
nobody wants.
Yeah, nobody wants to have a different opinion, and it's you look at the mainstream media, you haven't anybody who challenges WEF, for example, would be kind of looking askance. So that kind of goes to the point I wanted to make, that as the special editor of the American Journal of Economic Sociology, the second issue is going to be about climate change. So I guess people who are interested in this topic will find that issue interesting. But I guess I've changed my view after writing this paper about private force. So one of the things that was happening.
Well, what do you mean by private force?
Well, that's a paper that's in the being considered for the policy brief in the Henry George School of Social Science. So that would probably take too long to explain
Okay.
that. But I guess I'll get to it in a second. So, I've always been, an environmentalist since high school, I suppose. And now I've been at the end of my career after 47 years. And I tend to believe that we need to protect the environment. But lately, I've historically been a activist against, anti-war and anti-poverty and housing availability, to improve housing availability. So I've had a mixture of political sentiments. And lately, I found a group called the World Economic Forum that's just coming out crazy stuff that aligns itself with the what you call the climate alarmists. And whenever I hear anybody from WEF say anything, including Jane Goodall, who says that 6 billion people need to die to save the earth, I say, well, let me step back from a full throat support of the so-called climate alarmists and start studying what the truth is. So I've been more in tune with some of the arguments that go against it. So that's just, I was saying a few words in support of what you had to say, and I think it's going to be a great resource when we cap all these
Yeah.
That's all.
Sorry. Go ahead, Marty. Finish, and then Yanis will take over.
That's all I would say. But
Okay.
On the forest paper, essentially, after writing that,
Don't spill the beans, Marty. We are all expecting that paper. So
Yeah, I just wanted to know what the general what the word climate force means in a generic sense,
no, it was
or private force.
Private force. So essentially, what it means is that there's this concern that nations of the world need to reduce their emissions by so many percent per year and all this crap. But there's not a similar move to plant more trees, which is the natural mechanism to reduce the CO2. So it kind of makes me think that that there's a lot of social control in the climate alarmist camp, because I don't see a similar argument made for planting more trees. And that's all I had to say.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, that kind of comes into the micromanaging failures. Because, yeah, most of the people who are saying that there should be a carbon tax, that there could also be a bounty paid on doing things that sequester carbon.
Interesting. Okay, Yanis. Yanis, you need to unmute.
Yes, my question would be actually a follow-up on the vegetation comment by Marty. And I'm wondering if you know of studies of what the impact on vegetation, but more importantly, food producing vegetation would be if we reduce drastically CO2. I'm talking about specifically CO2.
Well, you know, it's called the greenhouse effect. And one of the dumb things that the alarmists said was that this will cause famines, and it actually increased production. Both warming and increased CO2 increases crop production. And you do that, people who have a greenhouse will buy bottles of CO2, and they will pump CO2 into their greenhouse in order to increase the rate at which the plants grow. So the idea that we would get famine and drought, as it gets warmer, it rains more. And so you can make a good argument that increased flooding occurs with warming itself. But increased CO2, I mean, the increased CO2 and the increased warm period has increased food production everywhere. And the greatest increase is in the northern climates, Canada, Siberia, Scandinavia, England and Scotland and Ireland. All these have seen increased food production. Canada now has 2 growing seasons. There's a lot of farmers who grow crops. They grow a crop, they harvest it, they plant another crop, and they harvest it. And they never did that until like the 90s. And so, yeah, one of the things that about CO2 is that it's not a toxin. It's a life support for agriculture.
Exactly. So my point was the exact opposite. I believe that the enemies of CO2 emissions want to cause famine and population reduction by that avenue.
That's, yeah, possibly. Although I don't think anybody anticipates that we will actually get the CO2 levels down to where they once were. I think the main argument is that we have to stop increasing the CO2 levels. And, you know, that's just to be fair to them. I think increased CO2 levels would probably be a good thing anyhow. One of the things that Reed Bryson mentioned in his talk is that it's global warming, it's global CO2. So he said there's nothing you can do about it in America unless you get the rest of the world on board. And he said the Russians aren't on board because it's too cold in Russia. They said global warming, we love global warming. The Chinese and the Indians aren't on board because their attitude is, You've been industrializing, you've been polluting for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now it's our turn. You know, you want to shut this down just as we're reaching the point where we can industrialize. We're not buying that. So then the question is, unless you can get a global treaty, how do you force it? And I have an answer for that, which is that if you do it right, if you replace taxes on human activity with a carbon tax, you can do it at the county level and your economy will benefit. You know, if you have let's take two counties. One, Bedford County in Pennsylvania, is a coal county. It's also very poor. But you can tax the carbon that you're producing because the people who own the coal do not live in Bedford County. So what you do when you tax the carbon, you tax the coal that they're mining, is that you're taking money that was going to go out of Bedford County and go to a Consolidation Coal, which is in Pittsburgh. You're going to take that money that's flowing out of your county and you're going to capture it for the people in your county. So you don't need to go global to do that. And if you're a county, let's say you're a county in Indiana, flat, it doesn't have minerals to speak of, and you just put a tax on things in proportion to how much it would almost be an import tax. Well, now you have to do it. A country could do it. Japan could do it. Japan is resource poor. Well, Japan could say, okay, we're going to tax the import of coal because Japan imports a lot of coal and a lot of oil, and they import almost all of their coal and oil they import. We're going to put a tariff on that coal and oil, which is a bad thing. Every Georgist knows that tariffs are a bad thing. But we're going to abolish our taxes on wages in the process and our general sales tax in the process. Well, they're going to benefit because they adopted a bad tax, but they replaced a worse tax. So
but wouldn't the inputs, the energy inputs that Japanese labor and industry needs, these reduced inputs will reduce like the number of jobs. So,
well, if you're untaxing the jobs, the guy who's say you got two plants and they both burn coal or they both use electricity, and the power plant, the electricity becomes more expensive because the electricity is made by coal. Well, one is they could go to nuclear, which Japan has a lot of nuclear. And the other is that they can, when they're untaxing wages, the plant that employs a lot of people for the amount of electricity it uses will profit even more than it was. And the plant that hires fewer people for the amount of electricity it uses will not do as well. So it's, and there's always this marginal question of, should we hire more people or should we buy another robot that'll do this automatically? And some things are just so much better to do with robots that they're going to do it with robots anyhow. And some things are better to just do with people. You don't want to go to a restaurant and have robots serving you, So there's always, but in the middle, there's that question of, should I buy a robot or should I hire another person? And if you have a tax system that makes the robot more expensive and the person less expensive, then you hire the person.
All right, so Dan, it's 8 o'clock, half an hour past the time, but it was a very interesting talk. If you don't mind wrapping up.
Okay, well, I don't see if I'm looking, there aren't a whole lot of things in the chat.
Okay.
But I would respond to them.
Well, some of it is from Yanis, and I think you addressed those.
Yeah. I agree that climate is not defined by what happened in the past 5 or 10 years, because there's the random variables within 5 or 10 years are great. So I guess that's it. Yeah. So oh yeah, Pittsburgh is much better off. Norman asked, is Pittsburgh much better off for cleaning up? Oh yes, it's dramatic. In fact, the reason we cleaned up is that Westinghouse and U.S. Steel, there were 3 major corporations that were going to leave. They were going to move their headquarters, and U.S. Steel was the biggest polluter in the county, but they were all going to leave because it was just so dirty here. You know, executives used to bring 3 shirts to work, and if they had a meeting in the afternoon, they would change shirts because the pollution was so bad that your shirt was dirty by the time an afternoon meeting occurred. It was just horrible. And you know, it was before I was born, or certainly before I was old enough to experience it. But yeah, if you just look up Smoky City on Google or search engine and do an image search, it's just horrible. There were times when you could not see the other side of the street just from the coal dust in the air. So, okay. Oh, one thing I'm just going to put this in the chat. Click on it. You'll love it. It's called Climate Change Trans Counseling with Will Franken, and he just skewers the entire emotional left kind of appeal. I think it's just a hilarious piece of work. Now it's very one-sided. It's on the denier side. I haven't seen anybody do a good skewering of the deniers that's that good. This one's hilarious. So when you're done, you click all the links and they'll pop up on click them quickly and they will pop up on your screen. And you can check them out as you wish. And that's it. I'm pretty much done. Give people a minute to click them and then we'll shut it off.
Good. Thank you very much. And while we are doing that, I'd like to remind you that this course will continue. We have one more session with Dr. Marty Rowland. Marty, if you don't mind, in a couple of minutes, could you just give us a teaser of what next session is going to be about?
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity. So the idea behind this course was Joe Polito watching the original broadcast of the presentation to the United Nations on decarbonization. So I'm going to present pretty much the same slides. I'll probably lean it more Georgist now that I have the opportunity and the choir. So what I'm going to be talking about primarily is the importance of infrastructure provision as part of the focus of an economy, and explore ways of getting to what's called the circular economy, which is a good thing, where we're eliminating waste, and by eliminating waste we might eliminate emissions and such. So what I'm exploring is the opportunity at every stage of the assessment as we get our infrastructure better and better are we better off going this way or going that way, rather than putting all of our eggs in the basket, saying that we need to decarbonize for some reason. It's more of a taking stock at what we have. And if decarbonization advances human health and perspective into the future, well, yeah, let's do that. But if it doesn't, then we need to be more, we need to be more concerned with humans in the numbers and the opportunities and the lower 99%, let's put it that way. That's my focus. But it'll be interesting. It focuses on one of my favorite topics, which is infrastructure. And I make some scientific explanation of how to arrive at decisions.
Sounds good, Marty. Very much looking forward to the session. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And we apologize for the time it took, but I think it was worth it. And good night, everyone.
Good night.